Recently, I have become highly interested in South Africa. I concluded that the country's history and present reality are incredibly complex and quite fascinating. What I find to be probably the most interesting about South Africa is that it is a country where some of the most important political topics of the past half of a century meet in one large, confusing mix. Demographics, colonial heritage, race relations, economic inequality, the competition between capitalism and socialism/communism, and the theme of identity and tribal politics are all crucial in the South African story. The definitive end of the apartheid regime came in the first general elections with universal suffrage in 1994, after which Nelson Mandela became the president. The regime ended in a time of high hopes and overly optimistic visions of the future of humanity. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, it was widely believed within the Western chattering classes that the democratic capitalist model of the West was now predisposed to gradually prevail all around the globe. The end of the apartheid regime was thus seen as a logical next step in this unstoppable march of liberal democratic capitalism. Francis Fukuyama, with his theory of the end of history, is the most well-known representative of this approach. He is usually seen as an author of childlikely naive and discredited visions of the post-Cold War world, even though I would argue that it is a bit unfair, since his essay on the end of history is markedly more nuanced than most people presume. Nevertheless, it still is a bit ironic that in the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama was one of those already taming the expectations, and his predictions for South Africa were actually pretty skeptical. He correctly saw the writing on the wall. The massive demand for economic redistribution of the white-owned wealth towards the black population, which many black South Africans saw as a necessary prerequisite of restoring justice, can only damage the South African state in the long run. He saw the greatest danger in the white emigration that would likely follow, saying, quote, "It is hard to overstate the potential economic disaster that would await South Africa were this to happen. The rest of sub-Saharan Africa has been moving backward economically at a breathtaking pace. Many parts of Africa are poorer than when they gained independence. Sadly, it would appear that colonialism, far from having been responsible for Africa's poverty, was in fact a major source of skills and infrastructure, and that the region has become worse off economically the further from colonialism it gets." End of quote. That statement would likely get you cancelled at many university campuses and newsrooms throughout the contemporary West. But that makes it not any less true. Apartheid-era South Africa was an island of European civilization and socio-economic level planted on the African continent, whose native populations were nowhere near this level themselves, even though the regime relied on their labor. It might be a hard pill to swallow for many, but it is the truth. Black Africans during the apartheid era lived in close proximity to the wealth and the perks of white society. Many have come under the impression that all you need to do was to dismantle the apartheid regime and give black people the rights they have been undeniably deprived of. And this comparatively luxurious lifestyle would just spread to the previously impoverished black masses. In the words of Helen Andrews, quote, "When F.W. de Klerk handed power over to Nelson Mandela in 1994, everyone hoped South Africa would continue to function as smoothly as before, just with different people in charge, as if de Klerk had handed Mandela the keys to his car. What really went wrong was this. It took European civilization centuries to get from dirt floor shacks to working light switches. Behind those advances stood revolutions in science, industry, religion, and social interaction. Those cultural prerequisites were invisible to many black South Africans, but they turned out to be essential." End of quote. In the 1990s, analysts around the world hoped that the fate of post-apartheid South Africa could be similar to that of reunified Germany, that the more prosperous part of the country could sort of absorb the poorer one into itself. That in itself shows the level of delusion that many people fall under in those times. The first thing to mention is that West Germany, the by far more prosperous and developed part of the country, was about 4 times more populous than East Germany. In South Africa, black people comprised over 70% of the population around the fall of the apartheid, and their share was rising rapidly. Moreover, while West Germany had been undeniably a much more developed country than East Germany, the difference was still nowhere near the level of the difference between black South Africans and white South Africans. East Germany was still an industrialized state that was able to provide basic government services to its population. Whatever one might think about communism, and I personally think it is one of the most unfortunate ideological endeavors in modern human history, the Eastern Bloc countries were quite good at educating their populations, especially in the technical fields which are most important for the functioning of modern countries. That can be illustrated by the smooth integration of the People's Republic populations into the Western economic supply chains, as well as their success as economic migrants in the Western labor markets. The issue with the communist regimes was that the relatively well-educated people then had to apply their education in an absurdly inefficient economic system run by party bureaucrats. In contrast, the difference between the living standards of many white South Africans and many black South Africans was really of a different magnitude. It often was a difference between living in a standard American suburb and an African shantytown. Now, to spend some time in the field of demographics. They are, as usually, often overlooked when decolonization is examined. The asymmetrical level of population growth in the former colonies and their European colonial overlords was one of the crucial factors in the equation that led to the end of this historical period. To give a couple of examples, the population of Britain in 1880 was around 35 million people, while the population of British India was 250 million people. A staggering difference even then, but the gap was about to become much wider. When British India gained independence, its population climbed to over 420 million people and was growing rapidly. Today, the population of the former British Raj is over 1.6 billion people, completely dwarfing Britain. While in 1921, the population of metropolitan France was around 40 million people, and the population of the French colonial empire around 55 million people. So, a relatively small difference when the size of the empire is taken into account. The contemporary population of former French colonies in Africa alone is almost 500 million people. Dutch Indonesia had a population of 60 million in 1930, compared to the less than 8 million people in the Netherlands. Today, the population of Indonesia is reaching 300 million people, while the population of the Netherlands is around 17 million people. While massive technological advantage can allow countries to control vast territories inhabited by often adversary native populations, there are limits to this approach. In South Africa, these considerations were equally important. South Africa gradually ceased being a British colony throughout the first half of the 20th century. In 1961, it gained full independence, when it became a republic and left the Commonwealth. In 1936, the black population stood at 6.5 million and the white population at 2 million. In 1985, on the eve of the last decade of the apartheid regime, the black population was reaching 20 million, while the white population had risen to less than 5 million. The ratio had not changed that much. It was still around 70% black and 20% white. But the sheer mass of the black population was growing rapidly, and this growth was only gaining pace. In 2001, the black population comprised 79% of the population and stood at 35 million. Meanwhile, the white population stood at 9.6% of the population, or 4.2 million people, so it had declined significantly. There has been a massive white emigration in the decade after the end of the apartheid, when approximately 800,000 whites emigrated out of the country. The white population actually rebounded slightly between the 2001 census and the 2011 census, when it stood at 4.6 million. A certain proportion of the mentioned emigres have remigrated back to South Africa, and there was even some new additional immigration from Europe. Nevertheless, the black population has just grown much more, from 35 to 41 million between 2001 and 2011. According to the 2022 census, this trend is only continuing. The black population of South Africa has added another 10 million during the last decade, reaching over 50 million people, while the white population is stagnating. The gears of the demographic transition are merciless, and the native populations of the colonized territories usually entered the rapid growth phase of the demographic transition, just as the growth of the European populations, both in the European imperial heartlands and in their colonial offshoots, was slowly grinding to a halt. Now, these demographic considerations were actually crucial factors leading to the establishment of the apartheid regime itself. There were two important issues. The first is how to manage democracy in a population where people are likely to vote in line with their racial interests, and one race comprises an overwhelming majority of the population. The apartheid regime's solution was to separate elections for each race. The second issue was the massively growing urbanization rate, due to the rapidly growing rural black populations moving to white-dominated industrialized cities. This urbanization has not only led to the frustration of the Afrikaner working class, since they had to compete with much cheaper black workers, but also to large informal settlements without proper public services growing around cities. Such settlements were were and are hotbeds of disease, crime, and poverty. Now, before someone accuses me of painting the apartheid regime in an overtly positive light, all of this was obviously set up in a way that would mostly benefit the white population and protect it from the negative aspects of the said phenomena. But it is good to clarify that the apartheid was not a result of a bunch of cartoonishly evil white guys trying to come up with the most racist state imaginable. However, it is important to acknowledge that the demographic situation of South Africa is much more complex and plastic than merely the black versus white dichotomy. The native African population consists of many ethnic groups, usually called tribes, with their own cultures and languages. The two most populous ethnic groups are the Zulus and Xhosas, together accounting for almost half of all the black people in South Africa. While there is a pan-African black identity in South Africa, the apartheid regime racial classification has made the creation of such an identity inevitable after all. There are also inter-ethnic politics of the different tribes. The prevalence of the Xhosas among the most important political figures of the early post-apartheid era, including both Nelson Mandela and the next president and the real political leader of the state in that period, Thabo Mbeki, was, for example, a source of resentment among the most populous Zulus, and so on. However, the white people of South Africa also have their tribes. The white population of South Africa is around 1/3 English-speaking and 2/3 Afrikaner. The Afrikaners are a very peculiar ethnic group. They are descendants of mostly Dutch colonists from the 17th century, who inhabited South Africa before British colonization. They possess a robust ethno-national identity formed by their Calvinist faith, which encompassed the thesis that Afrikaners are God's chosen people, similar to the Jewish Old Testament, and also by their armed struggle against the British, with whom they waged bloody and heroic wars for independence in the second half of the 19th century. The British prevailed, but Afrikaners could proudly say that they gave them hell, especially if the much greater British resources were considered. Afrikaners are frontier people, with great pride in their heritage, independent spirit, and resilience. But first and foremost, they see themselves as thoroughly African. You have to consider that Afrikaners have a history of 400 years in the country. When colonization began, South Africa was incredibly sparsely populated. While we do not have precise data, less than 2 million people have likely lived in an area double the size of metropolitan France. Now, it would be obviously highly reductive to view this colonization with pink-colored glasses. Native populations were resettled from some of the land that they historically used for grazing, and slavery was practiced until the British Empire abolished it in the 19th century. One of the many positive and often underappreciated gifts of the British to the civilization. But in many ways, the Afrikaner origin myth is very similar to the settler origin story of the Americans. The very prominent difference is that 90% of the native population of South Africa was not wiped out by old world diseases, to which they had no immunity. Even South African President Jacob Zuma said, quote, "Afrikaners are the only white tribe in a black continent or outside of Europe, which is truly African." End of quote. Afrikaners dominated the South African renowned farming sector, and the apartheid regime was first and foremost an Afrikaner state. They are concentrated the most in the inland administrative and judicial capitals of South Africa, Pretoria and Bloemfontein, and the northern suburbs of Cape Town. The English-speaking whites in South Africa, descendants of the British colonists, are more urban, liberal, wealthier, and cosmopolitan. Even during the apartheid era, they were significantly more wealthy than Afrikaners, and there is likely still an income difference to this day. Most of the poor whites in South Africa were Afrikaners. The English speakers dominate the white population in Johannesburg, coastal cities like Durban or Port Elizabeth, and southern suburbs of Cape Town. When researching this video, I have repeatedly seen the opinion by South African black people that while Afrikaners are more likely to be overtly racist towards black people, they are also much more likely to regularly interact with them or befriend them, and are more straightforward to deal with. The English speakers are often more liberal and progressive, but are the kind of people to secretly call the police when they see an unknown black person on their street. It might be only a stereotype, but it seems to me kind of similar to the way people often describe the difference between whites in the US South and the US liberal coastal cities. Historically, there have been certain rivalries between Afrikaners and English-speaking whites, with their origin going back to the memories of the Boer Wars. Still, the post-apartheid era has brought these groups closer together. When I talked about the percentages of white and black people in South Africa, you might have noticed that they did not add up to 100. That is the case because there are two other significant ethnic groups living in the country. First are the colored people, which basically means the mixed-race population. This ethnic group is most prevalent in the country's west, especially in the Cape province. Their origins go back to the time when the Dutch settlers intermixed with the native African populations, as well as with the slaves imported imported from the Dutch Malaysia and Indonesia. That created a specific ethnic group that was seen neither as white nor as black, but somewhere in between. Culturally, they have been closer to the white population, since the apartheid government gave them certain strategic privileges to strengthen the support for the regime, but also because they usually identify more with the superior status of the whites. That is a widespread phenomenon with mixed minorities. Between 2001 and 2011, they overtook the whites as the second most populous group in South Africa, due to their higher fertility rate. Economically, the colored people were wealthier than the blacks, but poorer than the Indian population, and much poorer than the whites. In 2002, according to one estimate, 62% of black Africans, 29% of coloreds, 11% of Asians, and only 4% of whites lived in poverty. That brings us to the last major ethnic group in South Africa, the Indians. They are descendants of migrants and laborers arriving from British India to the British colonies in Africa. As is usual with the Indian diaspora, they often played the role of merchant middleman classes in these countries, and usually rose to relatively prominent economic positions. It is similar in South Africa. The majority live in and around the city of Durban, making it one of the largest ethnically Indian populated cities outside of India. Their share of the population remains relatively stable, around 2.5%, and they are the second wealthiest group in the country after whites. They were also negatively affected by the apartheid policies, but as with colored people, not to the same extent as the native black population. Moreover, they were often resented by the black population due to their economic status. Interesting trivia regarding South African Indians is the fact that Mahatma Gandhi spent 2 decades in South Africa and engaged in a lot of activism. People often interpret his activism as an anti-racist struggle, but the reality was that he was mostly angered by the fact that the British administration treated the blacks and Indians the same, something that deeply offended Gandhi since he saw Indians as obviously superior. While Western liberals often have an annoying tendency to perceive racism purely as a white versus non-white phenomenon, the reality is that racism between non-white groups is very prevalent, and it is rather hard to find an ethnic group that has not been racist towards sub-Saharan Africans at some point. In the case of South Africa, these demographic changes collided with another crucial geopolitical earthquake, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. The African National Congress, a black liberation movement in the apartheid era, and then the absolutely dominant political party in post-apartheid South Africa, was heavily subsidized by the Soviet Union and was basically controlled by the members of the South African Communist Party. Many high-ranking NAC cadres were educated in Moscow, and the movement was packed with full-blown Stalinists. A significant portion of the ANC membership saw the fall of apartheid as a necessary first step in establishing an Eastern Bloc-style socialism in South Africa. Lots of them were trained by secret services in Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and especially by the Stasi, the East German security service. Many people have declared that their goal was to create an East Germany in South Africa, which is a bizarre and quite terrifying thought. While the apartheid regime was clearly seen as undesirable by the Western chattering classes, and a large public pressure was applied against it, including broad-based economic sanctions, during the Cold War, there was always also the prospect of the post-apartheid regime becoming a new, incredibly resource-rich member of the Soviet camp. The African National Congress had its own secret services and military wing, and was heavily involved with the Soviet-supported communist militias in other African countries, like Namibia or Angola. The apartheid-era military, the South African Defense Force, was on the other side of these proxy conflicts. The military expenditures of the apartheid regime climbed up to a whopping 9% of the GDP in the late 1980s, among the highest figures in the world. This financial overstretch, together with the fall of the Berlin Wall, clearly opened the way for the fall of the apartheid regime. Suddenly, there was no geopolitical reason for not being tough on the apartheid regime. The apartheid leadership saw the writing on the wall, and the last white South African president, Frederick William de Klerk, gradually dismantled the apartheid regime and allowed universal suffrage. In 1990, the ban on the African National Congress was lifted after 27 years. Many exiled ANC members returned to the country, and Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa after an overwhelming electoral victory for the ANC in the 1994 first free elections. Now, there are 2 very positive historical outcomes that the ANC leadership that took power after apartheid must be praised for. The first thing is that the transition from apartheid to a one person, one vote style democracy did happen without major bloodshed. There was a lot of political violence in the final years of apartheid. It was an incredibly chaotic era in which the African National Congress, the Zulu Tribe Ethno-Nationalist Party EFP, and the apartheid security forces were all present in the country simultaneously. Nobody knew for sure who secretly worked with whom, and a huge amount of political, criminal, business and other interests overlapped. There were certain groups within the black population who wanted blood and revenge, and there were certain groups in the white population, predominantly in the Afrikaner-dominated security forces, which would put up armed resistance to such attempts. The situation could have led to disaster, but it did not. Nelson Mandela and de Klerk deserve historical recognition, since the massive authority of Nelson Mandela certainly played a role in this outcome. The other positive outcome is that South Africa has not become a socialist state. If there is one alternative historical timeline in which South Africa would almost certainly be in an even much worse state than it is today, it is the socialist scenario. Fortunately, the discreditation of the communist/socialist economic policies by the collapse of the Eastern Bloc resulted in almost everyone heavily warning the ANC leadership against the socialist path, and they listened and suppressed the communists within the movement. Other than that, the ANC leadership was painfully unprepared for governance, and the following years proved this reality. Corruption was absolutely endemic. Promises were made to the public that would be hard to achieve even with the most competent government on earth. The ANC promised to build 1 million homes in 5 years, to redistribute 30% of the land, to provide 10 years of free compulsory education, to create between 2 and 5 million jobs in 10 years, and to provide free medical care for all children under 6 and their mothers, even though there was absolutely no planning involved and no extra money reserved for this. None of the pledges had been fulfilled. The ANC had no real economic policy for the country. Many of the ANC cadres had been in exile for decades and had literally lost touch with the country they were about to govern. Others were still caught in the mental traps of the state-planned economy paradigms. In the great book on the post-apartheid history of South Africa, the author R.W. Johnson recalls that one of the prominent ANC intellectuals told him that the future prices of gold, one of the country's most prominent commodities, do not really concern them, because the ANC had a party commission on that question and it's been decided that mining will play a much smaller role in the economy. Today, mining is becoming less important in South Africa because of the frequent power blackouts and deteriorating road, rail and port infrastructure. I doubt that is what they had in mind. In conversation with another high-ranking ANC intellectual, the key economic thinker Alec Erwin, it was revealed that the economic expert did not understand the concept of shareholder equity, but he confidently assured the journalist that the large number of state-owned steel mills would soon be constructed. They were not. Nelson Mandela was a great national symbolic figure, providing the country's leadership with much international credit. Still, when it came to the governance itself, especially its economic aspects, he did not engage in it much. He himself confessed that he did not really know much about economics. He became a figure that world leaders and celebrities loved to take pictures with, and he shared the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize with President de Klerk. Many white people became disillusioned by the fact that a whole lot of the same politicians that just a couple of years before were willing to put young people in jail for evading conscription into the armed forces trained to fight terrorists, basically a code name for Black Liberation Movement, were now enjoying their time in the limelight of global attention for their moral decisions to dismantle the apartheid. Many of the black folks were disillusioned by the fact that the end of the economic sanctions that came with apartheid had often led to a massive economic profit for the mostly white big business owners, and the economic inequality thus got even worse. When the apartheid regime restrictions on the freedom of movement were lifted, many black businesses went bankrupt because they could not compete with the suddenly available white businesses in the previously white-only areas. Many of the black people who managed to get rich, the so-called black diamonds, suddenly seemed to have adopted many of the luxurious, wealthy white people's hobbies, such as ranching, and seemed to behave towards the poor black people with even more contempt than the whites. Almost everyone was disillusioned with the large-scale affirmative action, except for the relatively narrow, educated black middle class that profited from it by getting lucrative public sector jobs. As usual with affirmative action, the state services provided suffered. The country's ruling classes were painfully passive when tackling the several AIDS problem. The president of South Africa between 2009 and 2018, Jacob Zuma, had unprotected sex with a woman that he knew had HIV in 2005, but claimed it was fine since he took a shower after the deed and thus was in the clear. Sigma move. When on trial for corruption, the same president said, quote, "Corruption is only a crime in the Western paradigm. The country today has the highest income inequality on the planet and is in the top 10 countries with the highest murder rates. These two statistics are interconnected, since when one looks at the countries with the highest murder rates, it's not the poorest ones, but the most unequal ones. The power grid is facing regular countrywide blackouts due to the neglected investment in the maintenance and building of new sources to keep up with rising demand due to population growth. Johannesburg and Cape Town, the country's largest cities, are now dealing with massive water shortages due to droughts, poor planning, and bad crisis management. When the mask of civilization slowly slips away, the wealthy enough to afford so will try to manage on their own. Gas power generators are a standard for dealing with blackouts in middle-class suburban homes. Private security agencies employ more people than the army and the police force combined. The outside walls of homes, often with electric fencing, have placards showing which private security company is about to show up if the house residents push one of the panic buttons in the case of a home invasion. There are wealthy urban districts in South Africa where private organizations take care of much more than just providing safety. They also take care of the infrastructure upkeep and many other roles usually reserved for the state or the municipality. Murders of Afrikaner farmers, motivated both by enrichment and likely sometimes also by racial hatred, became a world-known phenomenon, even though it is fair to acknowledge that violent crime is an issue affecting all South Africans. Immigration is also quite a hot topic in South Africa, since many people from other sub-Saharan African countries migrate for better paying jobs in South Africa. That has often ignited large protests from the native black South Africans, which have often turned violent. It is not uncommon to find polls in which the majority of the people claim life was better during apartheid. Indeed, there are many signs that the country is effectively regressing. It opens a few interesting questions. I have recently read a new book by John Gray called The New Leviathans, and an interesting thought caught my attention. Because of the incredible brutality of some of the 20th century totalitarian dictatorships, we usually think of tyranny as the worst possible way of state organization in regard to the human condition. But throughout history, anarchy and chaos have been actually usually much worse than tyranny. Tyranny tends to be predictable and rule-based, even though oppressive and often brutal. The constant uncertainty of anarchy might very well be worse. It is good to keep in mind that in the context of the incredibly murderous totalitarian tyrannies of the 20th century, the apartheid regime was relatively moderate, even though it was an oppressive regime. White South Africans are to this day often blamed for many of the shortcomings of the country, even though their proportion of the population declines constantly and their political power is negligible in the democratic system. Slavoj Žižek, even though I do not agree with him on almost anything, once said that one of the psychological advantages of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe was that people always had a scapegoat. Whatever went wrong or did not work was the fault of the party and the regime, never the good people themselves. After the fall of communism, this psychological crutch was gone. I suspect it might be rather similar in South Africa. Some people will just always blame the apartheid regime and the white population for the situation, even though it is a tough position to realistically hold after the last 30 years have passed. The peculiarity and the fascinating elements of South Africa are connected precisely to the huge contrasts. It still is Africa's most industrialized, technologically advanced and diversified economy. The skyscraper-filled downtowns and upscale seaside suburbs are still filled with luxurious properties. Western expats are working on their laptops in coffee shops within stylish city districts. The 2010 Football World Cup was held in the country and was an overall success. At that time, it could have seemed to the world that the country was on the track to greatness. But the last decade showed the cracks beneath the surface in their full scale. The port of Durban, the biggest commercial port in the country, is losing business to competing ports in Mozambique, since the losses due to heists on highways and railroads are widespread. Sometimes, parts of railroads are just dismantled by people to be used for scraps. Food imports are gradually rising, even though the country is endowed with great agricultural potential. The country seems to be on a path to deindustrialization, since industrial society cannot function without a reliable electricity supply. Many right-wing people tend to view this development with certain malevolent delight, as a confirmation of their views on the capabilities of Africans. But it is in our interest for sub-Saharan Africa to develop, especially in Europe's interests. The continent's massive population growth, in combination with prevalent poverty, guarantees huge levels of immigration to Europe throughout this century. While a couple of decades ago, South Africa seemed like the sure bet for the economic leader of the continent in this century, now it does not seem so certain. I think other countries that might be able to grow independently without the burden of the past race relations intermingling with their economic potential might have a better chance. If you finished this video and hopefully found it interesting, I just want to once again ask for your support on my Patreon. Researching and making these videos takes quite a lot of time. I will level with you guys. The amount of money from YouTube ads isn't exactly a fortune, and with my current view counts, getting paid promotion to my videos also is not all that easy. Some time ago, I made a tier on my Patreon that is just $1 a month. That is like half of what a beer costs in Czech pubs nowadays. So, if you enjoy these videos and would like me to continue making them, please consider this form of support. It would mean a world to me. Thank you very much.